Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome you to Hartford Seminary campus, where I am sitting tonight and where you are looking in on from your many places in the world. Welcome to the annual Hartford Luce Conference this year, focusing on Christian-Muslim relations in the midst of the pandemics, activities, opportunities, and challenges. And I am reminded of the importance of not just one pandemic, but both pandemics. And I'm delighted our organizers are choosing to focus on both tonight. My name is Joel Lohr. I have the honor of serving as the president of Hartford Seminary. And as so many of you know, Hartford Seminary is a place of so many firsts. And I believe the leading, if not one of the best graduate schools in our country for religion and theology, and especially interfaith work. Though we're not large, no one really does what we do in the way we do in terms of religious studies and dialogue. Founded in 1834, Hartford Seminary is proud to be the first seminary in our country that opened its doors to women in 1889. We're also proud to be the first seminary in the country to start a center for the study of Muslim-Christian relations in 1973, even while our history of engagement with Islam, hiring Muslim professors, and Muslim-Christian relations goes back so much further. If you look into the history of Duncan Black MacDonald, who we believe to be a true hero here at the seminary and are so honored, served here at the seminary for those years, many years. We also started the first Islamic chaplaincy program in 2001, a program that is going strong today and will celebrate its 20th anniversary, and maybe more about that will come up during these events. Also proud to be the first seminary in the country to establish a chair for Shia studies and dialogue among Islamic schools of thought in 2015. I just want to thank you for spending time with us tonight. The truth is, we are really about people, about engagement, about talking to each other and learning from and with each other. If you don't know much about us at Hartford Seminary, please do take a look at our web pages and Facebook pages and elsewhere. You'll see lots there. I don't want to take too much time. I know you have a very full program for tonight. I do want to thank all of our panelists, our esteemed group of individuals who are going to be speaking tonight and tomorrow. I also want to thank those who are working hard to make this a success. There are many of you behind the scenes, some of you on the Zoom not being visible, but you're making sure everything is happening. I want to thank you. And probably most importantly, I'd like to publicly acknowledge and thank the Reverend Dr. David Grafton, who serves as our academic dean. David, I continue to be so impressed by everything you do, and especially putting together these Luce Hartford conferences, which are amazing and always good and always at the cutting edge of important issues and feed the many people out there who need them, and I'm one of them. So thank you, David Grafton. Dean Grafton, I'm going to pass over to you to introduce the conference and the speakers and so on, but I just again want to thank you for this event and all that you've done to put it together. If you're out there, I don't know, you can give a round of applause to David, but David, thank you. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Joel. You introduced me already, so it's wonderful to be here this evening. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. And I do know that you are from all around the world this evening, or today. So you're welcome. This is the 5th year of our Christian-Muslim Relations Conference series that has been made possible by a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. And so we're grateful to the Henry Luce Foundation to making this possible. And these conferences have focused on contemporary and timely issues that affect Muslim-Christian relations. In past years, we focused on the issues of refugees and forced migration, the environment, race and racism, the role of women's voices and leadership in religious communities, and this year, the pandemics. Now, we've constructed this conference around the theme of pandemics because, as Joel noted, we recognize that the global health pandemic of COVID-19 has been laid over top and intertwined with the long-standing pandemic of racism in the United States and North America, and with ethnic and interreligious tensions in various places around the world. This is the second year that the Luce-Hartford conference is virtual. And so this format has allowed us to include and bring in participants from around the world. So whereas in past years, we've held the conference in successive evenings on the campus at Hartford Seminary, this year, we will have our second session tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so that we might receive and hear from panelists from various parts of the world, including Lebanon, India, and Indonesia. And so after tonight, I invite you to that session tomorrow, as well as our final session Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock for a discussion with the troupe from Silk Road Rising to hear about their interfaith work and understanding through performance and the impact of the COVID on their now virtual work on the web. However, tonight we begin our conference with our first speaker, and I'm delighted that we'll be able to hear from Dr. Kamila Mu'min Rashad. She is the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation. Through Muslim Wellness Foundation, Dr. Rashad has also established the annual Black Muslim Psychology Conference, which, if you've not had a chance to browse that website, which is linked to her bio on our conference page, I encourage you to do that because it's very impressive. Dr. Rashad is the visiting professor at Bayan Claremont Islamic Graduate School, and this year, the visiting professor at Chicago Theological Seminary, one of our partner institutions, by the way. Dr. Rashad's clinical and research areas of interest include religion, race and identity development, spirituality and psychotherapy, first-generation college students and emerging adults of color, healing, justice, and faith-based activism, racial trauma and healing, the psychological impact of anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Blackness, Black Muslim psychology, and Black Muslim intersectional invisibility. So there is no one better to address this topic tonight of the pandemics than Dr. Rashad. Dr. Rashad earned her first degree from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a Master of Education in Psychological Services there. She earned a second master's degree in restorative practices and youth counseling, and she completed her doctorate in clinical psychology at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia, not far from where I used to teach in Philadelphia in Mount Airy. Tonight, Dr. Rashad will be presenting The Light of Faith, Spiritual Resilience, and Coping in the COVID Age. Following her presentation, my colleague, Dr. Norton, will engage in a question and answer with Dr. Rashad. Dr. Rashad, we're so glad you're here. You have the floor.
Well, thank you all so much for this invitation. I am really excited to be kicking off this conference. And I hope that what I'm able to offer by way of the research that I've conducted, my own observations, my own lived experiences will be meaningful and also definitely food for thought and for discussion. So if you will bear with me, I will share my slides. Okay. And I'm really excited to share about the research that we've done through the Black COVID survey, which was conducted last May and June of 2020, because honestly, it had a really profound impact on me just to be able to hear from Black Americans across the country about how they're coping, right? What does this time mean? And it has been still, I learned so much about what it means to be aware of the context in which we live, to hold on to the light of faith, and also to challenge ourselves to really think about what is this moment calling for us to do and what is it calling for us to be? how are we different as a result of the experiences we've had over the last 18 months? And so what I'm sharing with you are reflections from Black folks across the country, sort of integrated with what it means for us to really leverage spiritual resilience and also to understand at times its limitations. What must we do? What are those works that we have to leverage so that we can really fully live into our values and obligations as people of faith, to alleviate suffering and to also allow space for joy and for happiness, and for rest. And so I offer you these questions and this information, and then hopefully a really fruitful dialogue. So this quote, "the light of faith," actually came from one of the participants in our study. And I'll read it to you because this was one of the first responses that I read, and it really impacted me deeply. And this 29-year-old East African woman said, "I'm doing my best to hold on to the light of faith. I've had a lot of dark days and have had difficulty coping. I can't sleep at night. My mind is always racing, thinking about how brief this life is. Black death is prevalent. Black abuses have escalated, and to be forced to stay home and not be able to do anything to fight back has made coping with this pandemic a heart-wrenching one. I am more angry than ever. I find myself moving towards feelings of apathy. And this is the most terrifying consequence of this pandemic. To be indifferent about what is happening all over the globe in an effort to protect my sanity would be to sacrifice the softness of my heart. But every day it feels like an inch closer to despair. To be Black in this time is to be beaten to a pulp with just enough life to keep our blood flowing. I don't know how much I can take." And so I don't know about you, but I've read those words many times, and they always force me to pause and to think about just the depth of the pain that I hear in those words, and also what did it mean for that individual, for that young woman, to talk about her faith, to talk about what it means to hold on to that, right, in light of all of these abuses. So I want to provide some context. What is this environment that we're in, right? What are we facing as we think about these twin pandemics? So racism and coronavirus. I like to use a lot of images because I think sometimes the images might evoke feelings and thoughts that we might often, and this is sort of me speaking as a psychologist, that we might sort of intellectualize, right? If we're thinking about the words and we're sort of mulling them over. But images are another way to help us open up those spaces that we might be reluctant to explore. And so these are the headlines, and these are from last year, right, around the time that we began to disseminate the survey and to ask for responses. So there's this disproportionate impact, right? And that was the story about COVID-19. It's also about sort of uncertainty about school and education. It's the particularly heavy burden that was placed on Black women during this time. And that continues. Thinking about also environmental injustice and institutionalized racism, thinking about our elders and what it meant to quarantine and to feel socially isolated as a result. And then there are the numbers, right? And this is as of Tuesday, March 2nd of 2021, 73,326 Black Americans are known to have lost their lives to COVID-19. And that means 1 in 555 Black Americans has died, right? And that's the second highest mortality rate after Indigenous or Native people in this country. And again, these are numbers that take my breath away. It means that there are almost 75,000 people who are no longer with us. And even if one of those people, right, had just one loved one, right, now we're talking about 75,000 people who are experiencing profound grief, right? But we know those individuals are also a member of families, part of communities, right, part of larger societies, and are also impacted. So when we refer to this pandemic within a pandemic, right? What exactly do we mean by that? And it looks like this, right? More headlines. And this is what we're inundated with. And perhaps we become desensitized to the way that these pandemics are discussed in the media. But this is what we're faced with, that coronavirus and police brutality roil Black communities, that when police kill Black people, the whole community suffers. And this is an era of peril for Black mental health. And just more recently in the New York Times, thinking about throughout the trial over George Floyd's death, right? Killings by police mount, right? That 3 people a day have died at the hands of law enforcement. And so what we sought to do at the beginning of this survey was to really think about what is the impact beyond the numbers, beyond the headlines, beyond sort of the streaming sort of ticker at the bottom of your screen. What does this mean for the impact it has on communities across the country? And our sample was very ethnically diverse. It was of Black Americans, of those who self-identified as Black across the country. Almost 1,000 participants had so much to share. So just for those who are wondering, the methodology behind the survey was a convenient sample done from May 6th to June 14th, and it was IRB approved by the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So who were the folks that responded to our call to share about their experiences? Of almost 1,000, right, 845 respondents we were able to analyze, and had almost equal numbers of those who self-identified as Muslims and those who self-identified as Christian, which allowed us to do a really rich comparison, right? What is the role of faith? How are we understanding what it means to be both a racial and religious minority as a Black Muslim? And so we had some really just amazing and thought-provoking responses. And so of those who did share, 186 participants also identified as neither Christian nor Muslim, but as Jewish, Buddhist, African religions, unaffiliated, agnostic. But the sample size of those categories were too small for us to analyze. But I was really encouraged to see that we were able to reach those who, again, did not identify as Christian or Muslim, but are also drawing from other traditions in order to cope with this moment. Our sample was overwhelmingly female, about 70%, and also those who identified as gender fluid or non-binary, and some of those who didn't respond. What we intentionally sought out to do with the survey is just to ask people, how do you identify as it relates to gender? How do you identify as it relates to sexual orientation? How would you describe your ethnic or racial background? And doing that, again, allowed us to indicate to those that we're not forcing, or we would not want to force categories. We want to invite those who first identify as Black or African American to share with us, right? And we wanted to, lessen or reduce some of those barriers to participation, simply because people feel excluded or they don't feel seen. So this is actually one of the aspects of the survey that I thought was really encouraging, and also something that I will, make a point to continue to do. Our sample was overwhelmingly heterosexual, with some indicating that they identified along the LGBTQ spectrum. And again, we wanted all of those folks who identify as Black in this country to share their experiences, given the fact that all of those identities, whether they're privileged or minoritized, will also contribute to the lived experience. And if we don't know, or if we're not actively seeking those who represent multiple communities, our information, our knowledge, and our awareness of how people are impacted will be deficient. So we tried as much as we could to get a representative sample, and for the most part, we were able to do that. Other demographics, 70% of Muslims and 84% of Christians had a 4-year college degree or higher. So our our sample kind of skewed more towards those who were formally educated. Muslim respondents were more likely to be married compared to Christian respondents, and about half reported that they also had children. The personal experiences with COVID, we asked, right, of your family members and friends, who do you know has had COVID, had symptoms but not tested, currently diagnosed or diagnosed and then recovered? And what we found, again, this was about 3 to 4 months into the pandemic, is that there were a sizable number who either knew someone who had symptoms, had been diagnosed, or had been diagnosed and recovered. And so when we asked also about, kind of expanding the social network, right, our sample, about 2.5 was the average number of loved ones who had died of COVID-19, right? Now, this is 3 to 4 months into the pandemic, that for the most part, right, each person knew at least 3 people almost who had died. And for our Christian respondents, the number was even higher. And so we wanted to know, what does that mean, right? When there was still, right, especially at the beginning, so much confusion, so much misinformation, so much fear, and that continues, but definitely at its height when the pandemic really first started to emerge and impact our communities. What did that mean to lose loved ones so early in the pandemic? So we also asked them to complete some quantitative measures, right? But what we noticed was that, again, the women in the sample indicated higher levels of stress, which corresponds to what we have been discussing and kind of known since the beginning, is that the burden of caring for, right, family members, loved ones, while also perhaps working from home or maybe not having sort of the privilege of being able to work from home, a lot of the labor fell on women. And so it is not unsurprising that women also reported higher stress levels. Sort of counter to, I think, many assumptions or stereotypes about Black folks, the folks in our sample actually said that they have sought mental health counseling, or that they were currently in therapy, or they were looking. So about 60% of Christians had said they had sought mental health counseling in the past, and about 52% of Muslims had also reported seeking counseling in the past as well. So this quantitative picture told us that Muslims represented diverse ethnicities, including West and East African and also Caribbean, also a range of Islamic theologies, and employment experiences were different from Muslims, that many reported at higher levels that they were essential workers. Many also said that they had been laid off due to the pandemic. And so this was something that we saw and wanted to kind of understand, again, the impact of the economic uncertainty on stress levels. And so this really called for us to ask the question, how are you coping? How do we make sense of these numbers, right? They only paint one picture. So the impact of COVID-19 fell into these 4 domains: financial health, family and community well-being, physical health, and also psychospiritual well-being. And what this meant, right, for us is that our participants were able to share with us in their own words what this meant. And this 21-year-old African-American Muslim man said, "I have been extremely demoralized lately to have witnessed the significant uptick in police brutality, white supremacy, and utter disregard of Black and brown people and communities amidst the pandemic. Feeling like whatever we do, there is a permanent target on our backs for merely existing." This 54-year-old African-American Christian man said, "I feel safer being indoors and feel safe that my family has to stay indoors. This is due to police brutality and other ways domestic terrorists affect the Black community." The 68-year-old African-American Christian woman shared, "Being older, quite afraid of being perceived as not worth saving and a status as a throwaway person. I'm aware of ageism, but this pandemic has intensified such feelings in me and many of my peers." This 72-year-old African-American Muslim woman said, "I'm tired of being labeled most likely to die first because I'm poor, Black, and elderly." A 38-year-old East African Muslim woman said, "I have surges of anxiety. The disparities Black folks are experiencing in infection, testing, and treatment have reinforced the general anti-Blackness of this country." This 50-year-old African-American Muslim man said, "Each day is a universe. There is no normal day, no normal routine." And the stress of COVID has been exacerbated by the disproportionate loss of life in my community, the sustained aggravated assault on Black bodies by the police, and by systemic racism and racist rhetoric in this country. I've been especially traumatized by the visible killing of George Floyd and the insidious video of Central Park Karen. Now, I want to pause here because no question in our survey asked our participants to respond to a prompt about racial violence or about police brutality or about racism. What they offered, right, was a testimony to what was happening in their lives, not simply because of COVID-19, but everything that is sort of in the air, right? What we're all witnessing, seeing, experiencing, enduring, feeling is what they shared. So we didn't have to ask the question, what do you think about what's happening? Or what are your thoughts about Black Lives Matter? They told us. And for us, this was an indication of just how much it was top of mind, but also because it has been chronic, right? It's a chronic stressor. And it is one that makes the experience of a global health crisis that much more intense. So our broad question was, overall, how are you coping with the COVID-19 pandemic? And the coping strategies fell in four main sort of areas. And what we were really encouraged and curious about is how are people making sense, again, of what they're sharing with us about the twin pandemics, the police brutality, the loss of life, the Black abuse, and on top of that, health disparities that are a function, that are part of the systemic nature of white supremacy in this country. How are people coping with all of that? So coping strategies fell, right, in these one of four areas. And most people made use of all four, right? So when we look to the left at problem-focused coping, that's about personal efficacy, right? What precautions can I take as an individual to reduce my risk of infection, of exposure? I'm going to adhere to the CDC guidelines. I'm going to exercise, right? I'm going to wash my hands. I'm going to sanitize. So this is what folks told us. This level of personal efficacy was able to grant some measure of control over a really unpredictable, uncertain, and terrifying disease. Social support sounded like really being able to lean on family and friends, right? To spend that quality time with loved ones during social isolation, right? Making the best of, well, this isn't ideal, but how can I take this moment to draw closer to my friends and family? How can I use this moment to really appreciate those in my circle, in my village? Emotion-focused coping sounded like folks telling us that they had started therapy, that they had really begun to think about how to manage difficult feelings, how to acknowledge that they were scared, right? To acknowledge that the feelings of anxiety and depression had actually increased. And finally, meaning-focused coping is a reliance on faith and spirituality, and also racial identity as a source of resilience and pride. And it is the meaning-focused coping that I want to highlight for the next few minutes, because the personal efficacy, family and friends, managing difficult feelings, I think they speak to what we're often taught, right, or socialized to believe are the ideal ways, right? Like go to therapy, lean on family and friends, right? Adhere to guidelines. But this meaning-focused coping, right, and reliance on faith and spirituality and racial identity also spoke to how people are making sense of profound loss, profound suffering, and able to then talk about hope, to talk about what does it mean for me to survive through this. And it is this aspect, this meaning, and the understanding of what was shared with us about the role of religion, which is, I think, so incredibly meaningful for us to really explore and process. And then I'll have a few questions about it. So meaning-focused coping, I want to share with you directly from the participants in their own words what this meant. So a 61-year-old African-American Muslim man said, in spite of all the death, sickness, and trauma people are experiencing, not only here in America, but all over the world, one thing is certain, and that's God is in control. This is what meaning-focused coping sounds like. A 22-year-old Black Muslim woman said, I'm not super scared because I know everyone's death is pre-written and can't be avoided. At the same time, it is making me slightly anxious because I've barely gotten to experience life and I'm not super stoked about dying young. The 70-year-old African-American Christian man said, I'm one who believes in being content with my lot. And so I have the faithful stamina that says I can get through and overcome anything. As a Muslim and with Ramadan observance in the midst of COVID-19, life is more peaceful. It helps and redirects my focus away from the news and the images of death. And this is from a 51-year-old Caribbean Muslim woman. This 50-year-old African-American Muslim man shared, I accept the qadr or the divine wisdom or decree of Allah and know that with difficulty comes relief. Well, keeping my faith strong in Allah and understanding that this is His decree and that we must remain patient through adversity is how this 30-year-old Black Muslim woman described her ability to cope with the pandemic. This young 29-year-old African-American Christian woman said, I think about what my ancestors had to go through as slaves, then as Black people in America. If they can get through that, then I have the ability to persevere through this. That keeps me upbeat and optimistic. And this 24-year-old Black Caribbean Christian woman simply said, I'm hanging in there with the grace of God. I feel like the pandemic has forced me to slow down and rely more on God. I've been praying more, reading the Bible more, and watching sermons that relate to dealing with anxiety and finding peace during the pandemic by trusting God. So I want to pause for a second. I want to ask, what emotions or thoughts are evoked within you as you listen to these Black reflections on God, faith, and coping? What does it remind you of? What do you feel as you hear individuals around the world, or around the country, rather, talk about what it means to cope with racial violence, police brutality, white supremacy, health disparities, just the unknown and uncertainty of a disease that is ravaging the Black community? What emotions are evoked within you? I just want to give just pause here for about a minute. Just reflect on that. So as I listened to those reflections, I was both in awe and encouraged, and also, I have to be honest, a bit angry. We're living in a country in which those who are either descendant of enslaved Africans or who are Black immigrants, whether first, second, third generation, because of systemic inequalities, are being asked to withstand a level of suffering that is actually unimaginable to most people. And that the level of belief in oneself and belief in a higher power, belief in a divine, is what offers some glimmer of hope through the unimaginable. So I thought, well, how are we living in a country in which engagement in religion is pushed almost to the brink of the unimaginable, right? What does it mean for Black religiosity in some cases to be romanticized, right? To be seen as yes, right? And it's sort of the dialectic holding both at the same time, that the level and the depth of faith, of spirituality is awe-inspiring. And it also must make you wonder, why is it that we live in a country in which, in order to live, right, and not thrive, but in order to live and survive, one must have this depth of faith in the Creator, right? And faith in that there is some purpose, there is some meaning behind the suffering, right? We're living in a country in which those conditions are created such that Black Americans have to draw from such a deep well just to survive, right? So here's my question. When we study Black religiosity, when we study the ways that spirituality has been a source of coping, in what ways might we be contributing to the mammification of Black faith, right? And by that I mean the trope of the Black mammy, right, sort of originating out of slavery, is of a Black enslaved woman who is constantly nurturing, who is perpetually content, who is able to provide nourishment, not only for her own family, but for the white slave master's family as well, right? Someone who is rock solid, who is a source of strength and wisdom, but never asks for anything for herself, right? Just gives and nurtures and cares and protects, right? But doesn't ask for anything in return. And so when we're thinking about the ways in which Black religiosity and Black religion is deployed, right, is leveraged, are we leaning on or asking, right, folks to rely on a Black religion, and in that reliance, the evil of white supremacy, the danger and the damage of white supremacy isn't held accountable, right? Then when we talk about the responses to the pandemic within the Black community, and there is a rush to think about, well, how do we engage Christian leaders? How do we engage religious leaders in the Black community in order to mitigate some of the risk and exposure, right, and the devastation of COVID-19? Are we also asking this country to be held responsible, right, and to do what is necessary and that it should do in order to reduce the risk, right, the systemic risk as a result of white supremacy? So I want to offer that, as provocative as it might sound, that we have to think about both appreciating and being curious about the role of spirituality and a Black religion in coping, and also being sure, right, to think critically about how we might be using Black religion to shy away from the discussion of what this country owes to Black people, right? What this country must do in order to alleviate the conditions that Black people are under, which requires this level of coping in order to survive. So I'm going to shift gears, but it'll make sense, right? when we talk about environmental toxins, right, we see sort of this danger sign. Most of us can say, you know what? If I saw that, I would stay away. I would know that it's telling me something is toxic, right? To be careful is dangerous. If we saw something like this, we saw pollutants in the air, right, impacting the environment, there would be some agreement, right, that there is something poisonous in the environment that has to be remedied. Or if we saw this, right, there's something about the images that would disturb, right? We would see that there's pollutants, that there's toxins, that there's something in the environment that we have to remedy. There's also social toxicity. And this refers to the extent to which the social environment in which individuals are raised is poisonous. It contains serious threats to the positive and healthy exploration and development of identity, health, and well-being. So what are the social toxins that Black Americans face? Right? These are things that perhaps it doesn't look like smog in the air. It doesn't look like pollutants from a factory, but it's poisonous nonetheless. And so if we're paying attention to the social toxins, right, this is also what Black Americans are being asked to cope with alongside a pandemic, alongside racial violence. And so if we're thinking about, right, pulling together what we found in our survey and the responses that our participants really sort of testimony that they gave us about what this means, right? It means that there are structural inequalities, right, in those social toxins. It looks like, right, if we could sort of see the toxins in the air, it's medical apartheid, it's the carceral state, it's psychic violence, it's economic inequalities, right, that's contributing to those impacts, right, on physical health, on community well-being, on psychospiritual well-being, financial health. But when we're talking about coping, right, it is meaning focused, and that I spent a bit of time on, but it's also problem focused and the personal efficacy, it's the emotion focused and thinking about one's regulation just of emotion and experiences, and also social support. But often these coping strategies fall under what's called high effort and vigilant. And what do I mean by that? So this is the image of John Henry, and many might know sort of the story of John Henry, and it's coined John Henryism to connote this effortful engagement in strategies just to get through a day, right? What does that mean? What toll does it take on one's health? So it's the stressful, damaging health impact of thriving despite inequality, financial hardship, and racial discrimination. So while communities are incredibly resilient, there is a toll that it takes on one's body and mind and spirit. These coping strategies also fall under the category of vigilant, right? That it's the anticipation of discrimination and of mistreatment and of violence and abuse because of the past, and often due to race. So we have to ask ourselves again, what are the short and long-term consequences of high effort, vigilant coping due to racism, racial violence, and trauma? And do we expect Black religion to make it all better or to make it tolerable? What must we do? And our respondents shared with us a very acute awareness of what this means to engage in high effort, vigilant coping, even if it's based or alongside being able to access meaning from spirituality and religion. And this 61-year-old Black mixed race Christian woman said, it is difficult not to be fearful of the reality of much worse that is affecting Black, Latino, and Asian communities, both by risk of infection and risk of racism. It's hard to hold on to hope. I feel the communal impact of the pandemic, particularly the impact on African Americans and other people of color. I am concerned that we are working to return to a life that continues to not just disproportionately impact people of color, but sacrifices people of color and considers us disposable. A 53-year-old Black American Christian woman said, knowing the level of neglect or dismissal Blacks feel when seeking medical care makes it all more concerning that many won't even bother going to medical centers for fear that they will be turned away anyway. The deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor was paralyzing for almost a week. I had to pep myself up because my birthday is around the corner and I have to acknowledge my privilege of still being alive and breathing. As an African American, the hardest part has been seeing things like Ahmaud Arbery's death and Breonna Taylor's come to light. I feel scared in my own home, and I would love to meet with my extended family for hugs and reassurance that we will be okay, but for now we have to stay apart. Seeing something like that and not having anyone to be there has definitely taken a toll on my mental health. And this is from an 18-year-old woman. I'm fearful and deeply saddened by the post-COVID stress disorder we are going to see in Black communities nationwide. Therapy should be free right now, and a lot of counselors should take insurance due to COVID-19 because a lot of people are sitting at home alone, and for people with depression, this is not a good time. I have added worry, not only about my friends and family's well-being, but about the ways the pandemic will disproportionately affect Black and Brown communities and be weaponized against us. And so our faith tradition, many faith tradition, teaches us that with every difficulty, there is ease, right? That with the pain and the suffering and the challenges that both the violence and the pandemic poses, there is ease, right? What can we expect, right? When we are able to stay grounded in the idea that there is a divine decree, that there is wisdom that can be drawn upon, that there is a way to sort of lean into that uncertainty. And this is actually very difficult. I think that there are times in which Black religiosity or spirituality is valorized, but also seen as sort of pathologically irrational, right? Like, how can someone withstand so many hardships and circumstances, right? And still rely on an unseen God, right? But if there is a belief that with every difficulty there is ease, right? There is comfort and there is hope. Again, however, what must we do in the world in order to alleviate how intensified and exacerbated that suffering is due to man-made causes, right? Due to systems that are designed to crush people, not lift them up. So spiritual resilience and coping has been a tremendous resource during this time of uncertainty. And we must resist the urge to romanticize Black religiosity and the role it plays in providing solace, comfort, and meaning during tragedies and crises. What are the necessary works which must be leveraged to challenge white supremacy and anti-Black racism? What would it mean for us to discuss Black folks' desire to engage faith primarily as an experience of joy, wonder, and compassion, rather than the emphasis on faith as a means of coping with and resistance to white supremacy? And I want to end with this question, right? I want us to think about how we balance both awe and appreciation for the types of coping that Black folks are able to express and embrace and engage, and challenge us to think about, why is that so? Why is it that this level of engagement is necessary in this country, right? When we open up the possibility for Black faith to be seen as one of curiosity and challenge and, questioning, right? But when we're thinking about the kinds of nourishment and reassurance that religion and faith provide, often people shy away from questioning that, right? From exploring it with an open mind, because it's doing so much work, right? To protect and to comfort and to ground. And so what might it look like for our engagement of faith to be vulnerable, right? To be unsure, to be uncertain, for us to really push ourselves to say, I want to ask the question so I can deepen my understanding of my own experience of the world and of the creator, of the divine, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if religion is always being asked, right, to mitigate white supremacy, then we're going to have some really difficult conversations around what it can and cannot do what it should and should not do, and what is the responsibility of individuals to resist and to think about challenging white supremacy as the structure that is oppressive, that is damaging, that is corrosive. We have to ask, right, what would it mean for us to talk about Black faith and coping in terms of joy and wonder and compassion rather than resistance? So I want to stop here and leave us with that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rashad, for giving us such depth of insight, sharing deeply from survey respondents' own words about their experiences, and really calling us to think very seriously about ways in which we understand Black religiosity, and in this dialectic between seeing those sources of religion as strength, as coping, of contributing well-being, but not valorizing it, right? As you've so well articulated, as an excuse to not confront anti-Black racism, to confront white supremacy, to confront the pandemic within a pandemic. So thank you for this. I'm going to now invite us into a time of Q&A with Dr. Rashad. I am Allison Norton. I am the faculty associate in migration studies and congregational life at Hartford Seminary and the director of the Pastoral Innovation Network of New England. And so I'd love for you to go ahead and put your question in the Q&A chat forum that you will see, the Q&A tab in your Zoom menu. So go ahead and post your question there. And as we get started, I think, Dr. Rashad, one of the things that was so interesting to me about this convenience sample was that you actually had, like you mentioned, this really broader insight into the ethnic diversity, not just religious diversity, which you highlight, but also the ethnic diversity, right, in sort of the Black American landscape. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about some of these interesting, what you call the invisible intersectionalities. And I'm thinking in particular, as we look at this with gender, ethnicity, race, religion, you know, what were some of the highlights that came to mind for you in this research as you were able to do some of those comparisons?
Well, I think what stood out to me immediately was that we often don't have opportunities to do the comparisons around religion within the Black community. And this is often due to Christian hegemony, that there is a conflation of the African-American community with Christianity. And so when we're thinking about these intersections of also Islamophobia, right, that around the time that there is heightened police brutality, there's also deportation, which is impacting many of the Black African Muslims in our communities. And so when we're talking about, you know, when people reference sort of what is a quote Muslim issue and what is, you know, an American issue, what our participants demonstrate is that every issue is an issue for people of faith, right? Every issue impacts every community. And so when we're able to really gauge, right, what are sort of those segments of the community that are going to be more at risk or vulnerable, right? It is those who are undocumented. It is those who are more vulnerable to some of the economic uncertainty. And so what our sample really demonstrated for us was, how are we asking questions, and what are the assumptions inherent in those questions that begin to erase all of that diversity? What we also found was that with our Christian sample, they were mostly Protestant, right? And so to even sort of delve down a bit deeper, there were a few that identified as Catholic, and I wondered, well, what does that mean when those who identified as Catholic were also African and Caribbean immigrants, right? So what are the intersections there? So I would encourage, and this is something that we are going to really do purposefully in subsequent research, is to make sure we ask those open-ended questions, because though it takes a bit more to code and to sort of analyze, what it allowed us to do, and there were actually several participants that thanked us, right? They said, thank you for just asking me to tell you about me instead of forcing me to choose this box. And I think what that did was also to build a level of rapport between us as a research team and our communities that we really want to feel seen and represented.
It doesn't make the task of analysis easy, but like
no,
you said,
but honestly, the reward, I think, was that people did appreciate it. They said, thank you for this survey. Thank you for even giving me sort of this open-ended space to share. We said, well, what else would you like to tell us about your experience? And they had a lot to say. And so what that indicated to us was that people weren't asking, right? They were just sort of assuming, yes, there's a disproportionate impact on the Black community, but people are also thinking. And I think for me, and I'll say this last point here, the level of sophistication in the analysis of all of the intersections was incredible, right? Again, we didn't ask a question specifically about racism, racial violence, police brutality. It emerged organically. And so our communities are already thinking this way. And so our research should reflect, right, I think an appreciation for that level of analysis that's already inherent within community members. We just have to ask the right questions.
That's right. Yeah. As I'm waiting for a few questions to come in, I'd really like to have you dig in a little deeper on the ways in which I think both scholars and the media, government workers and the like, the way that we do often tend to pathologize a Black religion. And I'm thinking, from my perspective, I'm thinking as a scholar in particular, but you look at, the early histories in this nation, in the emergence of sociology and psychology as disciplines, and seeing in those early years, white sociologists pathologizing Black religion as primitive, as immoral, and the like, as a way to uphold the violence against Black Americans. And so I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about sort of in this moment in time, and for the community that we have here, which includes scholars, it includes religious leaders, what are some of these lessons that we can learn from this study as we engage in our work?
That's a really good question. The first thought that comes to mind is actually discussions around vulnerability, right? If we're, and I think with good intention, right? Sort of asking questions around how does Black religion function, right? But what we're often asking Black religion to do is to sort of be the miracle, right? And so when we do that, what becomes pathologizing is that we leave very little room for the practitioners of that religion to be human, right? To show their own confusion and fear and uncertainty, because the religion is supposed to provide all the answers, right? It's supposed to be a place to go that is unshakable and without question. But we're human. And part of the sort of deepening of awareness and also development and growth of any individual is space for question, right? Why do I believe what I believe? What does this mean? What about that part that I'm not quite sure that I can incorporate it into my practice, right? But what begins to happen is that if scholars especially sort of frame religion as almost as a utopia, that it isn't sort of a living, breathing experience that people have, then it becomes a standard by which the community must measure itself. But if someone is wrestling with like, yes, I believe in this God, but you know what, I'm also angry, right? Why is it that my people and my family are experiencing, you know, these tragedies, right? When I think about just the story that emerged last week about the 215 children that had been found through residential schools in Canada. And these were run by churches, right? And so when you're thinking about a people who have been demoralized and who have been subjugated in the name of religion, right? We have to be very careful about how we paint it as a binary, right? That it saves or it condemns, right? I think we have to do a bit more to challenge ourselves to say, well, how am I sort of escaping my own personal responsibility in the systems that are created to marginalize, and saying, well, you know what, I'll let religion take care of that, right? I'll let those people who believe in, you know, sort of this hocus pocus, this magic, right? This ever-present unseen God, I'll let that sort of deal with it and continue on. And I think that's very dangerous. I think it's maybe borderline unethical for us not to think about how we're asking religion to do the heavy lifting when we have an obligation to also think about our role in sort of spheres of influence and being able to challenge those systems.
We have a question from Nazila Iskandarova. Says, I appreciate the way you presented and also your questions for reflection as well. For many, it is difficult to find meaning amidst COVID-19. Definitely this crisis revealed existential concern. I wonder how you interpret our relationships with various communities to help us address suffering. What would your suggestion for faith communities be to create a working model for interfaith relationships?
Wow, that is a really great question. I'll do my best to take a stab at it. I think first, it's important to understand that what COVID-19 sort of exposed for many was already known to many Black people, right? They're, I think, still surprise and shock and despair at the depth of devastation. Yet this isn't, the experience of suffering isn't new in this country. And so I think that if we're sort of presuming that there was a healthy baseline prior to the pandemic, then I think we're having a different conversation. But the baseline for many in Black communities, but also in communities of color, was still experiencing, again, the toxicity of the environment, the toxicity of white supremacy. So it's thinking about the foundation was already cracked, right? And COVID is adding a tremendous strain on a cracked foundation. And so when we're thinking about engagement or making meaning of suffering, in some ways there is precedent, right? When I think about, you know, myself as a descendant of enslaved people, and also a descendant of white slave masters, right? That's a history that I have to wrestle with within myself, that there is already present and in the past trauma that is still unresolved, right? And so the pandemic is adding sort of another dimension to that. So we think about, well, how have people made meaning of unimaginable, unpredictable, chronic suffering till this point, right? And I think religion and spirituality has played a significant role in that. What I heard from some of the participants, however, was an acknowledgement that this is different than a natural disaster, right? This is different than there's a earthquake, and even with sort of natural disasters like hurricanes and other sort of phenomenon, there is a human element, right, to why we're experiencing these things at this level. And so I think to make meaning of suffering, we have to, again, if we're thinking historically of what people have relied upon, I think with a critical eye, think about the sense of purpose and hope and meaning that has been created, in some instances have been under duress, right? So again, to do the right, the dialectic, that this is sort of a hallmark and I think a source of pride that many Black folks feel, that the sense of connection and reliance on faith is just tremendous, right? And it is often sort of called on, at least in scholarly work, to sort of explain the suffering that is man-made. And so when we're talking about interfaith work, I think it's to acknowledge the ways that we might be absolving ourselves, right, of responsibility to challenge systems, right? That, I believe that as a Muslim and in my own practice, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, like, you should not go to bed hungry or full if your neighbor is hungry, right? That you stand up against injustice, even if it's against your own family or against yourself, right? And so this is my own tradition, calls for me to be in the world in a certain way, and that is not to absolve myself of the responsibility of having to act. And so I think our interfaith work, we should, again, challenge ourselves and each other to think about, are we living into that word? Are we living into that becoming, right, of believers who want to alleviate suffering in this world for others? I think that's the question for us that we have to ask.
Thank you again, Dr. Rashad. And just to close out this Q&A, let us know where can we find the results of this study? And if you have any sort of upcoming research that's relevant that you'd want to share with us, just say a word or two about that as well.
So for folks who are interested, we are piecing together different elements of this report for dissemination within the next several weeks. The blackcovidsurvey.com does have, you can watch sort of the webinar in which we disseminated the initial findings. What we're also thinking about is how we might expand on or explore more deeply, especially around elders. And so I was also struck by the respondents that indicated that they were feeling like, disposable, or just increased fear around like social isolation and risk still to this day. And so we want to deepen some of that exploration of the lived experience. But for those who are interested in what they can access now, it is at blackcovidsurvey.com.
Thank you so much. I do want to point out to the participants tonight, to everyone tonight, that the papers or the presentations from the conference tonight, including Dr. Rashad's presentation, will be published in an upcoming edition of the Muslim World Journal that's published by Hartford Seminary. So you can look forward to at least some of the reflections from Dr. Rashad in this work coming through that journal. Thank you so much for a lot to think about. Very much struck by the comments about if we think there was a baseline, a different baseline that's challenging for us to begin thinking about, to continue thinking about.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate it. We're going to move now to our first panel of the conference, an interfaith panel that's going to look at interfaith relations during the pandemics in North America. And for that, I'm going to introduce Reverend Rami Marcos, who is a PhD candidate here at Hartford Seminary, and he will introduce our panelists who will be presenting tonight.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. Welcome everyone in our first day of the 2021 Luce-Hartford conference on Christian-Muslim relation. This year we address the Christian-Muslim relation in the midst of the pandemics, activities, opportunities, and challenges. I'm Rami Marcos, a PhD candidate in Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim relations at Hartford Seminary. And I am honored to moderate our panel relations during the pandemic in North America and to introduce our panelists. Each one will have 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will have Q&A. Please submit or send your question to us during the panel anytime, and we will read it after the presentations. So for now, all participants, as you know, are muted, but you are allowed to post your question at any time. So our first speaker is Dr. Irfan Omar. He has a PhD from Temple University in 2001, specialized in Islamic thought with a special focus on interreligious connections between Islam and other religions. His secondary area of interest are Islamic mysticism and South Asian studies. He has edited or co-edited several volumes, including Peacemaking and the Challenge of Violence in the World Religions, co-edited with Dr. Dafi, The Judeo-Christian Islamic Heritage, Philosophical and Theological Perspectives, co-edited with R. Taylor, and The Christian View of Islam, Essays on Dialogue by Thomas F. Mitchell. He currently serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Ecumenical Studies and the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion. From 2010 to 14, he served on the steering committee of ethics. He served on the steering committee of the ethics section of the American Academy of Religion. His paper today will be on Christian-Muslim engagement during the 2020 pandemic, lesson from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Thank you for being here with us today, and I will present the other panelists when their turn will come. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rami. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for organizing this conference, Professor Grafton and your team. I'm going to try and share my slides. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so Rami, you can see my first page of my slide?
Yes.
Okay, great.
You might want to start the slideshow so it enlarges.
Yeah, but
okay. But that doesn't work for me because then it takes away my other screen.
Okay. All right.
So I'm going to keep it this way, if it's okay with you. Right. So the call for papers for this conference asks us to focus on the current state of Muslim and Christian relationships, to quote, as they impacted us, as the pandemic-induced crises have impacted them. And some of the questions that were suggested for this inquiry were, what sorts of pressures were placed on interfaith partnerships? Were there any interfaith encounters that resulted in positive outcomes? And to this, I've added a couple of my own just to guide my research. I may not be able to, respond to all of these, but I think for a longer paper, these would be very important to include. What is the role of faith in helping and the faithful deal with challenges in times of crisis? What motivated faith communities to come together to address specific issues? How have interfaith partnerships transformed as a result of current challenges? Has the interfaith infrastructure survived the crisis? As part of the research, I interviewed some of the key players in the Milwaukee interfaith community, and I asked them questions that were related to their personal experience, but also their observation of others in their communities. I will only share with you one of those for the sake of time. I asked them, what does it mean to you to be told to stay away from the very activity that is central to your practice of faith? And I was thinking of weekly communal prayer. So these were Catholics and Muslims, the people who I was speaking to. And, for many people, attending weekly prayer meeting and socializing afterwards are important ways, I think, that animate faith in their lives. And so the closures seem to have robbed such people of that part of their identity. Now, the findings based on these questions are not entirely surprising to me, but they may be for many Muslim and Christian practitioners, people who are not generally aware of interfaith realities within their group. So let me try to summarize that. And I know I have 15 minutes. I'm sure I will not be able to say what I need to say in that time, but I'll try. So the community and faith groups sprung into action fairly quickly in mid-March of 2020, soon after the announcements were made about closures and stay at home. In fact, all of the mainline institutions belonging to various faith traditions spoke in unison. The messaging was very clear and precise. They will strictly follow the directives from the health experts and government officials. And at the same time, they were committed to finding alternate and safe ways to do what they do best, which is outreach and service, addressing the spiritual and social needs of their members. The swift response was largely the result of having and maintaining a solid interfaith infrastructure. And I use the word infrastructure here to replace what some people call social capital. I think of infrastructure as kind of I think of relationships as highways, that allow us to access people and institutions without the usual social constraints. So like in many places, the Milwaukee interfaith community groups were prepared to take action in times of crisis because they have been facing challenges of one kind or another for decades. Crises have come and gone, and interfaith community has continued to grow stronger in Milwaukee like in other places. The question this time was whether this crisis is somehow different from others in recent memory, including 9/11. The current pandemic is global and paralyzing for the type of work faith groups do. They gather people, right? It is what makes community a community. So it is clear that the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted traditional patterns of worship and community life, but it disrupted much more than that. At the same time, the crisis brought with it opportunities for interfaith engagement, and this is sort of why we are addressing this topic. So let me go back to a little bit of a history. What is that interfaith infrastructure? So in 2020, early 2020, before the pandemic began, I published a book co-edited with Caitlin Daly that looked at some of the same themes, but in a historical perspective. And in this book, we showcased one of the earliest attempts at running a community-based interfaith dialogue. And it so happened that not many people knew about this, even in Milwaukee, that there is a rich history of Muslim-Christian engagement. And we can talk about the interfaith engagement separately because there's a parallel sort of or overlapping history of that. The Jewish-Catholic relations began a few years earlier. But let's focus on Muslim-Christian engagement because that is, again, a very unique history. So I call that beginnings of formal dialogue. And so this began in 1980 with two Franciscan nuns and a Muslim professor who was teaching history at the time at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And as you can see, two of them have died only recently after the publication of this book, or at least for Dr. Hamdani, after the first draft was of the book was ready, and he was able to see that before he died on 2 days before Christmas in 2019. Anyway, so at that time, in the 80s, the news of their dialogue reached far and wide, including some Vatican officials who, when they learned about this group, they called it the first of its kind. The first of its kind dialogue. World Council of Churches recognized this group. Milwaukee was basically put on the map at the time. And the dialogue group was professionally run and consisted of Christians and Muslims from various denominations and occupational backgrounds. It ran for about 12 to 15 years, given how you consider the cessation of the dialogue. And the participants in the dialogue continue to meet long after that. In fact, in the book, there's a snippet of the letter that Dr. Hamdani wrote to Sister Jacine in 2018, sort of updating him about his activities, and then Sister Jacine writing him back. This is 2018. While they are both, I think, suffering some kind of health issues, they continue to write to each other and to write to other dialogue members. In fact, the book argued that the 1980 dialogue group helped inspire many subsequent interfaith actors in the greater Milwaukee area. And so the book has a whole plethora of these stories. This is one photo that I think it might be important for us, because here you see that history connects with the present. And you could see in this photo on the left is Sister Lucille Walsh, one of the founders of the 1980 dialogue. And the person, a third person from the left is Sister Janan Najib, who is a well-known Muslim community leader in Milwaukee today and is responsible for a whole host of activities, intercommunal, interreligious, interracial events, and so on. So you have this kind of a link between the past and the present right in front of us. And just to stay in the history part, you have here Sister Jacine and Intisar Atta, two of the founding members of that dialogue. And they continue to meet over the years. They would celebrate Christmas together, and they would celebrate Eid together. And so that is also part of history. This is Sister Jacine in 2019, when she was 99 years old. And I have to share this anecdote because when I finished the first draft of that book that I mentioned, I brought this to her for her, just to kind of give us some feedback and maybe, point out some mistakes. And a week later, she asked me to come and pick that up. And there were 100 Post-it notes sticking out, as you can see that in the picture, in the photo there, with all her comments. So she was a professor through and through, and also she wanted to make sure that we get the story right. And she provided a lot of sort of material that went into that book. So anyway, so I'm not going to go into the second generation dialogue actors. I mean, you learn about Janan Najib, but I think it's, sufficient to say that because of that dialogue, because of that culture, because of those folks who were met for 15 years and made a lot of noise. They were publishing reports, and they were inviting the media, and they were receiving letters from the Pope. And so it's sort of created a sort of a culture of interfaith dialogue. But what that did is that the second generation people normalized activism that took into account interfaith realities of the society in which they lived. So they were already activists, whether Christian or Muslim or whatever religion. But what they did is they sort of began to look at it from an interfaith lens. And I think that is a huge achievement for a small city like Milwaukee. So the activities that they were involved in were, free healthcare clinics, food banks, clothing drives, educational and outreach centers, community tours, open houses to various places of worship. We're talking about in the 90s, and interfaith book club. They were really driven by the demands of their own faith and practice. And I could see that in the interviews that we did for this book. And yet they realized that their activities must benefit everyone in the community. So this was interreligious peacemaking at its core, I think. It was a dialogue of action. They were living the will of God in collaboration with people who invoked God in a different way altogether. And they practiced their faith while engaging with religious other in a way that advanced the cause of peace for everyone. So COVID-19, obviously we understand that it has caused individuals and to experience the boundaries of their freedom, right? Even nations and governments at one point appear to realize the limits of their power. At the same time, the creativity and resourcefulness displayed by many, I think, gives us hope and shows what is possible. And it enables all of us to find ways to connect, engage, and positively impact others. As noted earlier, standing up to the challenges during the crisis is not new to Milwaukee. They have unfortunately faced their share of crises and have always presented a united front, I would say almost always, against violence, against bigotry, and against hate. I will just show you this few slides to kind of give you as an example of how this community has persevered, but also became really resilient, partnered with civic society institutions of all kind to showcase, what interfaith activism can do. It can do much more than just simply having a civic society institution. These are the two individuals who came out as a second generation dialogue leaders, dialogue actors. In the 90s, Judy Longden was for a long time ecumenical officer in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. She's now retired. Janan Najib is still active. So Wisconsin, is well known for having a sustained history of Christian-Muslim dialogue and variety of dialogues, women's dialogue, clergy dialogue, and all sorts of other things. So I'm just going to move on to COVID. So what's happening here in the last year is really most surprising. I also have a section here studying the impact of the pandemic and the role of interfaith. What kind of studies have appeared that look at religion and the pandemic, but also interfaith efforts and the pandemic. I'm going to skip that part here. So what has been happening locally in Milwaukee? As I said, faith leaders, many of whom are also interfaith actors, began organizing right after the lockdown began in the mid-March. In fact, while other civic society institutions were still in shock, the faith leaders began to give interviews, and emails were flying all over to see what they can do. One of the big concerns was to address disruption of services due to the closure of mosques and churches. The need to find alternate ways of delivering social support and religious services was one of their main priorities. But how do we do that, without the possibility of gathering even in small groups? According to Sherry Hansen, who is the Interfaith Conference Program Director, religious leaders work diligently to learn the technology necessary for virtual interactions with their parishioners. They wanted to be helpful despite the fact that many of them did not feel comfortable communicating using that media. Also, many of the coordinated interfaith activities were facilitated due to the existing cordial relationships that I've already said that. So what I want to do is just showcase the few things that we have, that I have been able to document. In March of 2020, a local pharmacy chain owned by a Muslim family organized a free distribution of masks. And this is just right at the beginning when people didn't even know whether they really should be buying masks or how, what to do with them. In April and May, Christian churches and mosques opened and expanded their food pantry capacities to cater to those in need due to job loss. In April of 2020, there was a list of prayers compiled from various traditions to help those struggling with the difficulties arising due to the pandemic. It was called Seeking God in Times of Pain, a collection of interfaith prayers for enduring the COVID-19 struggle. Also
30
in
seconds.
April.
30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Also in April, there was a Milwaukee public radio program, Lake Effect. The title of that program was How Local Faith Leaders Are Encouraging Social but Not Spiritual Distancing. And so the resourcefulness was really, that struck me, because they brought in an astronomer, they brought in the meditation specialist, they brought in from different, they brought in legal experts to talk about what is normal in a faith, practice of faith at one time becomes prohibited in another time. So for example, communal prayer. So they were addressing these issues for Muslims and Christians who were really concerned about not being able to go to the mosque, not being able to pray communally and so on. So all of these needs were met to a degree by these faith leaders because they had the infrastructure, they had the highway, they could cross that space and meet the other there. Let's see. So there are examples here that relate to interracial, intercultural, and spiritual needs. And unfortunately, I won't have time to go through all of these. But let me just say, to conclude, one of the things that struck me is that not only that interfaith infrastructure survived the pandemic, what I observed is that it has made the actors more resilient and better prepared, certainly technology-wise, but also from the vantage point of learning that they will need to expand the demographics. One key factor here is that young people were not included as much as they should have been. So I'll stop there. I know that I've gone over time, and I apologize for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this sharing with us this great presentation. And I think we can follow up with the questions later and you can share more about this interesting case study. Thank you. So our next speaker is Reverend Dr. Whitney Bodman. He came to Austin Seminary in 2002 from Harvard Divinity School, where he completed his PhD in comparative religion and Islamic studies. He retired from teaching in 2018, but continues to write and teach and participate in some seminary and community programs. In 1977, MDiv graduate of the Youth Divinity School, Dr. Baldwin was ordained in the United Church of Christ. He pastored several churches in Massachusetts and was involved in interfaith organization, the Interfaith Relations Commission of National Council of Churches, and the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Christian dialogues in Massachusetts. Currently, he is co-moderator of National Council of Churches, Muslim Christian Dialogue, and a participant in the Jewish Christian Dialogue and an Interfaith Theology Working Group. His current research focus on the Quran, political theology, and Muslim Christian relation. In Austin, Dr. Baldwin is active with his church, the Congregational Church of Austin. He is past president of Texas Impact, an interfaith organization that seeks to help religious communities engaging effectively with the Texas state legislatures on a wide range of issues of public policy. His presentation today is titled The Muslim Space in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Dr. Whitney Baldwin, for being with us today.
Thank you very much. In 2017 in Austin, Texas, a group of women began to meet casually and then more intentionally to talk about their experiences in traditional mosques and the kind of Islamic experience they might want for themselves and for their families. These conversations resulted in an organization they called Muslim Space. They describe its mission as follows. Muslim Space is a Muslim community organization that fosters an open, inclusive, multicultural, and pluralistic space for self-identifying Muslims and the larger Austin community. It is founded on the Islamic principles of service to humanity and equal, respectful, tolerant, and egalitarian treatment of all human beings. Muslim Space provides programs, projects, and initiatives that cultivate and nurture an autonomous, diverse American Muslim identity, provide opportunities for Islamic enrichment, personal growth and advancement, social and charitable services, promote intra-faith and interfaith and cultural education and dialogue, and develop bridges between Muslims and across the larger Austin community. Over the last 4 years, Muslim Space has developed into a dynamic association that is still finding its way, but whose character is well formed. A recent survey of 70 responses shows that 3/4 are women, more than 3/4 are between the ages of 25 and 54 years. Over half have advanced degrees. Almost half were born in the US. Almost half affiliate with Sunni Islam, but the second largest cohort gives answers such as non-denominational, just Muslim, or prefer not to say. Muslim Space defines itself as a community organization. It is not a mosque. The leadership describes itself as third space, not home, not a mosque. Over half of the members also participate in a more traditional mosque. A few of its members are not Muslim, but want in one way or another to draw from Muslim spirituality, wisdom, and community. Many of those, of course, are Christian. One non-Muslim currently sits on the board of directors. The openness to non-Muslims to fully participate, even in leadership roles, is a remarkable experiment. Muslim Space is not an interfaith organization. I would describe it as a Muslim community that includes all seekers after God, whatever they bring to the search, however they pursue that search within an Islamic framework of seeking. One leader describes it as a community that also happens to include prayer, whereas most mosques are places to pray without community. Many of the women describe situations where they have felt unwelcome at mosques. One woman, who describes herself as deeply religious, spoke of going to a small mosque in a town to which he had just moved. The World Trade Towers had just been toppled, but instead of finding a comforting, protective community, she was forced to sit outside among the shoes. She said more generally, I have been religious all my life and have never felt welcome in any Muslim institution. So I stopped going, until she helped to create Muslim Space. Muslim Space is led mostly by women because women have most acutely felt the need for a welcoming space in which they can pursue their Islam with freedom and support. The bylaws specify that women must be at least 51% of the board and committees. It is not, however, a women's organization. They have struggled to attract men to the boards and committees with some success, but the expectation is that men are fully included. It does have some of the features of a mosque. There are Friday Jummah services, and during Ramadan, there were nightly Tarawih prayers and Quran readings. There is, however, a much higher emphasis on community. Interpersonal engagement is a vital part of the spiritual experience. Inclusion is a word that I have heard over and over. For many, the exclusion is of women, both from positions of leadership and from valued prayer spaces. For others, it is conversations that are excluded, conversations about divorce, adoption, the disabled, the non-Muslim. At least 2 members are Ahmadi. One, once exposed, was kicked out of her Sunni mosque. Most members I talked to, however, did not know that she was Ahmadi. Sectarian affiliation is unimportant. Others who are openly and specifically accepted are LGBTQ and transgendered persons, divorced women, non-Muslim families of Muslims, and people whose affiliation with Islam is ambiguous, non-traditional, or eclectic. Some in the established local mosques accuse Muslim Space of sowing division, and others reject its non-traditional stances. Resistance is mostly vocalized by the lay leadership of the mosques, while the imams largely accept its presence. Inclusion is a tricky concept. Where is the boundary marking what cannot be tolerated in a tolerant community? What intolerance merits exclusion? This has yet to be tested. Though a question came up with respect to Milad an-Nabi. Some wanted to have a Muslim Space event to celebrate the birth of the Prophet. Others were uncomfortable with the idea, it not being a part of the Islamic tradition in their view. The board made the decision to forego sponsoring the celebration on the basis that it has a sectarian character, and Muslim Space avoids the sectarian. A common observation is that most mosques are very cultural. Muslim Space is self-consciously and intentionally American. Many in the leadership have no noticeable foreign accent, even though some of those spent their early years in Muslim majority countries. There is a deliberate effort to minimize the presence of cultural elements that come from elsewhere, from home countries. The identity that Muslim space intends to nurture is designated as autonomous. One member described it in this way. In most mosques, there is a great deal of fear. Fear of angering God, fear of doing something wrong, fear of allowing what is American to deface what is correctly Islamic. Thus, uniformity and conformity are important values. But Muslim space sees itself as a community in which everyone is encouraged and supported in their own journey to God. Every journey is autonomous, unique to the individual, but every journey, even the journey of a non-Muslim, is nurtured by the community. Journeys are sustained not only by community, but also by education. There is a remarkable focus on learning, making use of organizations such as the Bayan Islamic Graduate School and the Usuli Institute, as well as individual lecturers such as Hartford Seminary's own Ingrid Mattson. There is a monthly book study reading Sherman Jackson, Khalid Abu al-Fadl, Mustafa Iqbal, and others. Ms. Ghada Ghazal conducted a 2-day workshop on Islamic law. The effort to provide thoughtful exploration of things Islamic is persistent and draws on scholars with both classical Islamic and Western education, with a preference for women. Another important aspect of support recently manifested itself in the establishment of the position of chaplain. This did not come about as a result of careful planning, but rather was an opportunity that fell into their laps. It is, however, a perfect match for Muslim space. There has been a great deal of conversation over the 4 years about whether to have an imam. An imam provides an authoritative, learned presence. But imam also centers the organization in the particular views of that one person. Instead, Muslim space has sought to establish a committee of carefully chosen scholars to provide guidance on specific questions. That committee has not developed very far, in part because it has not yet been needed. A chaplain not only provides a source of Islamic knowledge, but also reflects the focus of Muslim space on nurture. The current chaplain, a Muslim with an MDiv degree from my seminary and enrolled in the Hartford Seminary chaplaincy program, has been consulted by some 50 people since January. He also runs 2 support groups, meeting twice a month, in which the focus is on storytelling and reflecting on those stories together in the light of faith. About 30 people participate in that program. The pandemic has affected Muslim space in both positive and negative ways. The greatest loss is, of course, the community. They have found ways to move most events online. This is, after all, an educated group that knows all about Zoom, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Canva, and whatever else is necessary. They have moved craft get-togethers, game night, book club, Quran study, as well as the Jummah khutbah online. Salat is performed in private. On the other hand, because community and interpersonal engagement were already priorities of the organization, once the pandemic imposed separation, the expectations of support and the tools to deepen that support were already present to address the new stresses. The pandemic and the presence of a chaplain has revealed the importance of attention to the spiritual and emotional, There are deep needs in the community. Many of those needs are not the consequence of the pandemic, but have been present all along. There are many who now think that having a chaplain is far more important than having an imam, and fits better with Muslim Space's self-understanding and mission. As with other communities that have established an online presence, Muslim Space has attracted participants from all over the nation and the world. Visitors to the program are finding a community the likes of which they had never imagined. There is a growing awareness that the model that Muslim Space is developing might be, to overstate the case, franchised, since the needs it meets and the ways that it goes about meeting those needs. Those needs have existed elsewhere as well.
2 minutes.
Okay. One might say that the pandemic hit Muslim Space at the right time. The organization has matured enough to have an established membership and a firm self-understanding, but not so much as to have established traditions that anybody is reluctantly to leave or change. It has yet to encounter a significant challenge to its ethic of inclusion, either internally or externally, though such challenges will certainly come. The pandemic has revealed the depth of personal need in the Muslim community, and Muslim Space is uniquely shaped to meet that need, not only through the chaplaincy, but also as a community dedicated to support the unique journey of each participant, Muslim and non-Muslim, within the sustaining embrace of community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rodwan, for sharing your study about Muslim Space. It was great to hear it. Yeah. So our third panelist, Mrs. Ornissa Faryad, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name in a right way. She is the head of outreach at the Old Dulles Area Muslim Society, Adams Center. She is also the director of outreach for Multi-Faith Neighbors Network. She is the secretary of the board of directors at Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy Leadership Circle for One American Movement, member of Fairfax County Faith and Equity Committee, and involved with many other faith-based organizations. She is the founder and music director of Americans First Mosque Youth Choir, the Adams Beat Choir. She is the founder and co-host of the Sisters Act podcast, along with co-hosts Dr. Sabrina Dent and Rabbi Susan Schenkman. Conversations center were around shame, stigma, rights, and social justice issues, and how our faith address these topics. Her talk today will be on my journey with the evangelical Christians at Adams Center before, during, and after COVID. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Rami, for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here and listening to everyone today and listening to their stories and their journey. I really get to see an insight of other people and the work that's going on. And I'm so happy to see that people are still moving and doing things even during pandemic when things normally people were expecting us to slow down. I want to thank everyone at the Hartford Seminary and especially Dr. Grafton, who has really been a pinnacle counterpart in this whole process with me, at least. And I really appreciate all of his emails and his feedback. As Rami stated, I had the outreach department at the Adams Center, which stands for the All Dulles Area Muslim Society. It's the second largest mosque in the United States, located in Northern Virginia in the city of Sterling. And because we're situated in about 30 minutes west of DC, we are kind of in the know of everything in terms of if something happens and the Muslim community needs to be engaged. Usually a lot of the agencies reach out to us at the Adams Center. We serve about 25,000 American Muslims, first generation, second generation immigrants, you name it, we have them. And so it's been a pleasure working there for the past 11 or 12 years. But my work with the evangelical Christian community here in the United States has been a learning experience. And I'm going to share my story with you through photos. And I feel that that's the best way for you to kind of see what I'm talking about when I go through the different events that have happened in my life. So I'm going to share my screen. And okay. So you guys can see that screen, I'm guessing. So I'm going to start out with the work I started doing with Peace Catalyst International, which was founded by Dr. Rick Love, who was an evangelical Christian pastor. He passed away last year, the end of 2019. He became a pinnacle force in my work. There's Rick. When I last saw him in Seattle of 2019, and you could tell that he doesn't look that well. He was battling cancer, and Rick Love was a man of God. He loved preaching about God. And the first time I saw him was when he invited me to be part of the Peace Catalyst Seek the Peace movement, where they wanted a Muslim female from DC to be the counterpart for this work. And so someone suggested me to him. And so he called me up, and I ended up going to Duke University. That's where we had our first meeting with everyone. And to be honest with you, I was kind of scared in the beginning. Here I was, a Muslim female in hijab, going to Duke University to meet a bunch of evangelical Christians. And if you know anything about the evangelical Christian community in the United States, they have the highest rating in numbers of a group that really has a bad perception of Muslims. And so I was kind of hesitant, but nevertheless, the New Yorker in me was like, I'm going to go and I'm going to meet these people and see what they have to say, because on the phone, he seemed really nice. And so we went and we had, just a great connection off the bat, because everyone there was working on this notion of doing work that God has commanded us to do. This picture I'm showing you right now is, you can see in the front, there are about 5 Muslims praying, and behind them is Bill. And I've already asked everyone if I could use their name in my presentation and in my paper. And the interesting part is that the book on the table says Salam, which means peace in Arabic. And, it's part of the Seek the Peace program's initiative to promote peace between evangelical Christians and the Muslim community here in the United States. And Bill was so drawn to the Muslim prayer that he decided to follow the prayer in his own way. He would go up and down and then sit on his knees. And I was sitting there watching this, and I took a picture, and, by the end of it, Bill was crying. And I thought that was really interesting. And so when I spoke to him about it, he said that your prayer connects me to God as well. And who am I to say that the way you pray is wrong and the way I pray is right, when we're all praying to that one God? And I felt a connection to God watching you guys pray. So I joined you. And I thought, wow, this is great. Like, this is completely not what I was expecting. And I really also appreciated none of the Muslims going up to him and saying, well, you're not Muslim, you can't pray with us, and all this other nonsense. That did not happen. So I was really glad that the Muslims in the room were cognizant of the fact of how they're supposed to talk and relate to other people when we're doing interfaith or multi-faith work through these different events. That was a very captivating moment for me. This is just another part of the seminar where we were learning about the differences between Muslims and Christians in the United States. What does it mean to collaborate? What does it mean to understand one another? Then our next meeting was in Seattle, Washington. This is Marie on the left and Shanaz on the right. They're both from California. They're each other's counterpart that work together through Peace Catalyst in California. I unfortunately at that point did not have a counterpart in the DMV area, which stands for the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, because they couldn't find someone at that point. So I was doing all my work by myself, which was an interesting thing, but nevertheless, it worked out well. I was able to do what I needed to do here in my community. And so we went out to eat after, different parts of our conference, those 3 days. This is my friend Susan. She's from Louisville. She's part of Peace Catalyst there, and with her husband, who's now the acting director for Peace Catalyst since Dr. Rick Love passed away. And the baby, I love babies. So whenever I go anywhere, if there's a baby, I'm usually drawn. I will be the one taking care of the baby and holding the baby and talking to the baby. So I pretty much kidnapped Rebecca's baby so she could work and do her thing so I can watch her baby and play with her. Actually, her name is Trinity. And the whole thing of it coming together was really interesting, of how we were able to connect with one another on a human level and see each other as being able to respect one another and to grow from one another and to understand and respect the fact that we do have differences, and those differences make us who we are, and we should celebrate those differences. But highlighting the human aspect of our relationship is really important as well. We went out to eat here at I think it was a Turkish restaurant in Seattle. That was really yummy. I'm all about food. So if there's food, I will be there. I think there's nothing more engaging besides food and good jokes. And that's something I feel the two communities should work more on in ways of being able to communicate with each other better and learn about one another. And then finally, my counterpart, Becca, came. They finally found one, and she lives in Springfield in Virginia. And she and I hit it off really well. We're like best buddies, even though there's a huge age gap and I'm much older than her. But she's one of the kindest, sweetest persons I know. She's very devout in her religion. She's a very caring person. I look at her like she's my younger sister. The way we interact, it's a great example for other people to see that Muslims and evangelical Christians can do a lot of great work together and be friends and be like sisters, like we were blood sisters. So last year during COVID, we couldn't have iftar outside. Everything was at home. So we decided to do a virtual iftar, and Becca's up there. And then our other friend, David, and his wife are on the top screen. He's also an evangelical Christian. And then on the bottom of the screen is me and my 4 daughters. We decided to have this iftar and kind of talk over what it means to fast and what the month of Ramadan means and how God calls us to do good and how we're supposed to get closer to him. And sharing that with them was really insightful because they learned a lot about the American Muslim experience, but also during COVID, how we are coping about, around COVID with our faith traditions. The mosques are closed, the churches are closed. How do we celebrate a whole month of fasting that's supposed to be a communal event, but now we're doing it by ourselves at home? So, the virtual Zoom pictures and screenshots have become very popular. I don't know who Dr. Ali for school board down there is under my name, but that's what they gave me in terms of the link. For Eid, Becca made me ma'moul cookies, which are cookies stuffed with dates. She brought those over all the way from Springfield to my house, which is about 30 minutes away. She lived in Jordan for a while, but these are the kind of things she was doing. She was giving me, gifts for all the Eids, and, I would give her gifts. We would exchange gifts all the time, just to, expand on that friendship and sisterhood that we have. A few months ago, I took her out to Pakistani food because she loves spicy food. And so there's one by my house. It's called Tuso. It has really great Pakistani food, and she loved it so much so that she wanted to bring her fiance over there as well. So I'm hoping that they're going to visit there soon. And then this is a couple of weeks ago, the last couple of days of Ramadan this year, we went to DC, and all 4, Becca, David, And her two friends also came. They're also part of the evangelical Christian church that they go to. And I talked about Ramadan and iftar, and I opened my fast there. And Becca's fiance brought the food from one of the local Lebanese stores. And we just sat, talked, and really had a spiritual experience about what fasting means, because one of her friends was fasting also, but her fast was like, I will fast until God tells me to stop. And I thought that was really profound that she was able to share that with us. And then, of course, Becca and her fiance are getting married. So I'm invited to the wedding. It's in August, and I'm really excited. So much so that I offered to sing at her wedding, and that I would never do for anybody else. But I love Becca with all of my heart that I did offer that. I do have a music background, so she's special in that sense. I'm looking forward to her wedding. And now I move on to the One America movement, which is another organization that I got pulled into doing work for them. I'm also on their leadership circle advisory board. The One America movement does a lot of work pertaining to movements around issues that are plaguing cities and areas within the United States that really need help. So here we are. There's Andy, he's this director, Anna, and Rabbi Aaron, and Pastor Joel Rainey on the right in the suit. He's from West Virginia. So you can see that we're from 3 different Abrahamic faiths, but we work together to address the issue of opioid addiction in West Virginia. That's our main focus right now. We've been meeting for like about 2 years, either at Adams or the synagogue in DC or Pastor Joel Rainey's church in West Virginia. This is some of the things we do. I take my kids to these things as well. We pack things for those who are in recovery centers in West Virginia who need help, who don't have money to take care of themselves, but we want them to live with dignity. And that's something that all of our faiths promote. So you have Muslims, people of the Jewish faith, evangelical Christians in the room working together to make these packets for those who are in need. These are some of the women of the group that come together. Again, women from 3 different faith groups. This is when I brought the kids over there, and we did a 1-day retreat in West Virginia to learn about hate and what it means to hate, or learn about hate and how we can change mindsets within ourselves and the people that we're around. So I think the kids really enjoyed that event. And this is just them sitting outside eating. And then this is the group photo. As you can see, there are a lot of different actors. These are mostly my kids from my choir that I have, and they're quite entertaining. And then this is one of the other meetings that we had with the adults where, survivors or people who are going through recovery from opioid addiction come and tell us their stories, or their family members come and say what they went through and how much help they need and what it means to actually live with someone who has an opioid addiction.
2 minutes.
Okay, and this is some of the women who came to Adams for the Friday prayer. These are the men sitting at Adams Center for the Friday prayer, and our, Adams members coming and greeting them and saying hello. And then we had a little discussion downstairs. This is a panel discussion we had with 3 different faith groups at a synagogue. And then we met in October because we hadn't seen each other during COVID. So we did social distancing at a place in West Virginia. That was really nice. And then December of 2020, I was offered a job as Director of Outreach for Multi-Faith Neighbors Network. We do a lot of work for between evangelical Christians, Muslims, and the Jewish community to promote clergy to learn about one another, because that's where it starts. If the clergy aren't in the know-how of what they're supposed to say and teach to their community, they won't be able to engage people of other faith groups. And then also promoting religious freedom overseas as well. That's something that we're doing with the State Department and other agencies as well. So I will be traveling a lot. That was a job offer I could not refuse because it's right up my alley of the multi-faith work that I'm really passionate about and engaged. As you can see, these are all people of different faith backgrounds. I'm the only and first female employee, so I am very honored in that. And they will be hiring more females as well as time goes by. And I'm really looking forward to that work. And this is a meeting we had with Imam Majid, who is my boss at Adams, but he's also one of the founders of Multi-Faith Neighbors, and Pastor Bob Roberts and Rabbi David Saperstein. And this is a picture of me, last but not least, with Bob Roberts. He's kind of fuzzy in the background because the picture is focused more on me than him, but he's an evangelical Christian pastor from Texas, Dallas. And, you know, his whole passion right now is to promote religious understanding, acceptance, and respect. And as my boss, I really respect him a lot for the work that he's doing. And I'm honored to be able to do this work as a female Muslim in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your experience with the evangelical Christians. It was interesting, and we'll follow up with the questions later. Thank you. So our last and fourth speaker is Dr. Nazila Iskandarova. She has a PhD from University of Toronto, a Doctor of Ministry degree in Pastoral Counseling, Marriage and Family Studies from Wilfrid Laurier University, and a Master's of Social Work from the University of Windsor. She is a registered psychotherapist at the College for Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario, and a registered social worker at the Ontario Social Workers and Social Service Workers. She is the recipient of the prestigious Forum for Theological Exploration Research Award for her study on domestic violence against Muslim women, the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care Senior Research Award, and the Society for Pastoral Counseling Research Award. Currently, she is a faculty member at Emmanuel College of Victoria University, in the University of Toronto, teaching mental health and psychopathology and psychotherapy courses. Her book titled Muslim Women, Domestic Violence and Psychotherapy, Theological and Clinical Issues, was published by Routledge in 2018 and Islamic Spiritual Care by Pandora Press in 2019. Her paper today will be on when someone is dying, we prepare, the COVID-19 and the challenges to pastoral choice. Thank you for being with us today, and we are interested to hear.
Thank you, Remy, and it's a great honor to be here with you and present about the challenges that the COVID-19 brings to faith communities and members of many faith communities. I would like to share my PowerPoint with you. Okay, so before we start, I would like to start my presentation with land acknowledgement. And this is especially important when in Canada a few days ago, we were shocked by finding the mass graves of children in residential school in British Columbia. These children were members of the First Nations. The following land acknowledgement is adapted from a statement developed by the University of Toronto in consultation with First Nations House and its Elder Circle. And we use it at Toronto School of Theology often. And I would like to start my presentation with this land of acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the Toronto School of Theology, its member colleges and University of Toronto operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Before we start, after Harunisa shared her presentation in a joyful way, and it really brought joy to my soul, it's very sad to share the news today. We learned that in London, Ontario, 20-year-old man called Nathaniel killed 5 Muslims. And this was a hatred against Muslims, and still Muslim community in Canada and other communities as well tries to digest this news, and we grieve. In the midst of these challenges, we also struggle with COVID-19, and my presentation today is focusing on specific challenges that COVID-19 has brought to members of the faith communities in healthcare setting, and how other Muslim communities and also non-Muslim communities to come together to help each other to deal with these challenges. One of the issues, especially that relates to COVID-19 virus, is in response to the end-of-life care issues that many Muslims face in healthcare settings. And the chaplains, regardless of their faith, they help many Muslims to find meaning in the midst of this COVID-19 and implement the social, religious, and spiritual values at the same time. We know that COVID-19 also brought to our attention that our healthcare resources, economic and social resources, are scarce, and this does affect the quality of life for the sick and dying. And many Muslim families around the world, they also face difficulties and many limitations when it comes to take care of the dying and also complete the death and funeral rites as prescribed and informed in our faith tradition. I remember a community member who was 86-year-old Muslim female. She died in the hospital in 2020, especially in the beginning of COVID-19 in Toronto, Ontario. And the patient's family experienced trauma, not only by the death of their loved one, but also due to the challenges of getting the body out from the hospital's morgue and also arrange the burial service within 24 hours as prescribed in our Islamic tradition. They felt extreme guilt for not attending the mother's last moments due to the hospital practices. They felt that they supposed to be with their mother and be with them, be with their family members as well, and say the final prayers and read the Quran when their mother was dying in the hospital. This is a mild case that I'm telling to you, but I remember one of my students at University of Toronto shared the news in Sri Lanka, especially when Muslims in Sri Lanka, they suffered with new restrictions that Sri Lankan government brought to the Muslim community. There are very traumatic experiences in other parts of the world. For example, I read at the BBC News and that Fatima Rinoza, she was 44-year-old mother of three from Sri Lanka's minority Muslim population, and she passed away due to COVID-19, but the Colombo Hospital of Sri Lanka refused to return her body to the family. And the whole adult son was forced to sign papers authorizing her cremation, even though under Muslim law, we know that cremation is considered a violation of the human body. Fatima, of course, is not the only Muslim cremated due to COVID-19 in Sri Lanka. In my paper, I try to respond to some of the challenges that Muslim families and patients faced in regard to end-of-life care issues during COVID-19. Of course, it's impossible to respond to all these questions because we are still contemplating and reflecting on these challenges and trying to find the resources in our own tradition and also in other sources to respond to COVID-19 challenges in the healthcare setting. In the context of the concerns mentioned above, in the context of the cases especially, I try to examine certain rules of al-janaiz, funeral practices, particularly in regards to legal charge or obligation, and ahliya, the legal competence in the midst of COVID-19. What I really liked in presentation and also when I explored my question in regards to response to COVID-19 is collaboration and partnership with other faith communities to support the sick and work together to respond to society's crisis. Definitely, we are still working on a general framework for collaboration between Muslim community organizations, Muslim families, and healthcare providers, how we should address healthcare challenges in the midst of COVID-19 and also resolve ethical questions as well. Okay, so in regards to death and end-of-life care during COVID-19, what I learned is that our faith tradition, like many faith traditions around the world, is very flexible. We human beings really have the capacity to bounce back. Muslims accept the reality of death in regard to the temporal nature of earthly life. And we acknowledge that every soul will taste death as the Quran informs us. As it is well noted in the Islamic traditions that despite our attempts to find an elixir for everlasting earthly life, this is inherent in human life. And that is also mentioned in the Quran, chapter 4, verse number 78. So Muslims accept the Quranic position of live and let die. And this is especially evident in the famous Quranic expression again that all Muslims say in the event of death. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Surely we belong to Allah and to him shall we return. There's a famous prophetic tradition that remarks that die before death comes. This tradition also indicates the importance of remembering the mortal nature of earthly life in contrast to eternal life after death. And such an approach to life and death in the Islamic tradition allows us to see dignity in death as we see dignity in human life. In some situations, death even is seen as a blessing for the person who has intolerable and unimaginable pain. However, Muslims also view death as a beginning of a different form of life called al-barzakh, and that is the interval between death and resurrection. In the midst of COVID-19, Muslims are frustrated regarding these resources in our tradition. They were frustrated, especially in regards to some healthcare and government practices regarding death and burial challenges. So I will go into the detail in the context of the tradition that we learned in our tradition. So we know that Muslim families always feel obliged to comfort the dying person and remind them of the God's mercy and forgiveness. And for this purpose, there are specific rituals that Muslim families, they want to follow. However, during COVID-19, it was really very difficult to follow these rituals at the same time, comply with hospital protocols. So in our tradition, we know that we use Zamzam water from a well in Makkah, and also we recite the Quran. In some Shia traditions, they also use Ab Turbat, the sacred water coming from the Karbala. We Muslims believe that evil spirits attack the dead if they left in darkness. Therefore, we recite the Quran to remind the person about the mercy of God and compassion of God as well. Many Muslims, they may put the Quran or a lamp close to the person, dead body also, in order to protect the dead person from evil spirits. So we do have many, many rituals that we would like to follow in context of death in the hospital and also in other times. So in this respect, Muslim spiritual caregivers, they play an important role in taking care of the person. In the absence of Muslim spiritual caregivers, non-Muslim spiritual caregivers, and also chaplains, they also play an important role to fulfill these rituals and help the families to fulfill these rituals as well. So we do have flexibility, as we mentioned, regarding spiritual and religious practices during the COVID-19. So we Muslims understand that COVID-19 is highly contagious. This acute illness is especially posing health risk for people who suffer from underlying conditions and chronic health problems. For example, people who have cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and diabetes, they are vulnerable to COVID-19. And the health complications and mortality due to COVID-19 increase with various factors as well. We should consider the factors such as age, sex of the person, and also those belonging to specific ethnic groups such as Black, Asian, those coming from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and those living in intergenerational spaces as well. According to research, these patients who suffer from COVID-19 are at disproportionate risk of developing severe disease that require ventilation. So in regards to COVID-19, when the Islamic tradition has historically shown great flexibility, we also learn how to be flexible when we respond to COVID-19. Regardless of this flexibility, COVID-19 presents us concerns, such as patients and families are overwhelmed to accept healthcare prohibition of not visiting the sick. They are not able to decide what type of care is right for their loved ones. They are unsure regarding what would be best for the dying person. The patients suffer from psychological and emotional anxiety and fear of dying alone and being cremated, like in Sri Lanka. They have an anxiety of being buried in a simple container with no viewing or visitations involved. The families are not able to fulfill traditional memorial services after the death of the loved ones. Friends and communities cannot help families cope with patients' deaths and associated grief, mourning, and bereavement. Regarding the challenges mentioned above, COVID-19 has also triggered questions regarding making healthcare choices in end-of-life situations, especially regarding the rights and obligations of patients in different situations. And in this context, how Muslim and non-Muslim chaplains and also faith communities come together to help the patient and their families to find meaning for their existential crisis. So in general, the Islamic tradition encourages Muslims to follow certain guidelines regarding of the level of the legal competencies in regard to rights or hukuk, and these are protection of ad-din, protection of a life, protection of dignity, protection of intellect, protection of property. So these are very important rights in the Islamic tradition that we should follow in the healthcare context as well. But there are some conditions that there is no capacity or shurut or ahliyat in respect to aql, bulugh, ilm, hurriyat. The general types of legal competences are with regards to the acquisition of rights, ahliyat al-wujub, and also with regard to execution of obligation, ahliyat al-ada, might be affected due to certain conditions. And we realize that during COVID-19, for example, we do have this kind of a lack of competencies as well.
2 minutes.
For example, Islamic traditions, thank you so much. Islamic tradition says that there are certain obligations that we should not follow when we have particular challenges. For example, when the person has illness, when they have the loss of consciousness, when they are infant or childhood. So in regard to how Muslim communities come together to help the Muslims to practice these rights, very important, especially in the context of death. And regardless of competencies, these rights and hukuk should be practiced in healthcare settings as well. In that respect, we realize that advocacy is really very important, and advocacy for the patient cannot be done without collaboration with other faith communities. And I would like to give you some examples. For example, in the United Kingdom in 2020, there was some distressing news, and that Muslim communities and Jewish communities came together to respond to this distressing news. There was some news that those who died of COVID-19 might be cremated against the will of their families in United Kingdom. So Muslims and Jewish groups, they called the government to uphold Article 9 of both the European Convention on Human Rights and also Human Rights Act 1998. And these conventions and also Human Rights Act protects the right to freedom of thought and also religion. In Sri Lanka, for example, I remember that my students told me, and also I read from the news, that religious minority communities came together in order to respond to government challenges. In this respect, Muslims supported Catholics in their effort to tackle the discriminatory policies of the government. They supported Catholic leaders Oshala Lakmal and also Ranmal Antony, who also initiated petitions regarding fundamental rights in the Supreme Court in Sri Lanka. Other human rights organizations, including Organization of Islamic Council, World Health Organization, Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, and the Universal Human Rights Council, they came together as well to support these petitions of Sri Lankan Muslims and also Catholics as well. So these are the examples I would like to share with you, just to bring to the attention that when we advocate for patients, our patients and their families, it's impossible to do it alone. We need to come together in order to respond to challenges that this COVID-19 particularly brought to us. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Nazila, for examining this important topic for Muslim community during COVID-19 pandemic. It's interesting, and thank you. So I have a question, like a general question to all of our 4 panelists, and you can answer it like in 1 minute or 2, and then we will conclude if we have time or not, we will see. So my question is, God willing, inshallah, as we move out from under COVID-19, what do you think the COVID experience will do to interfaith issues in your context in the future, in your area, in your case study, in the topic, or for other issues you experience today?
I can start. So I think COVID has added a lot of great features in terms of technology being available to us during COVID. Although we're not seeing people in person, a lot of, that has stopped, but nevertheless, the conversation has still gone through. People are still being able to connect to one another. Had it not been for COVID, all the people here who are coming from all over the world would not have been able to listen to these conversations, and we would not be able to have this dialogue that we're having today from people just in their offices or in their homes having this conversation. But I think the most important thing is that the interfaith or multi-faith work that we're doing needs to happen in person. There's a different dynamic that comes in when people are in person, in the same room, having tea or coffee, and having discussions with one another, seeing our facial expressions, being able to, even pat someone on the back or shake their hand, brings a lot of a different element in terms of connecting with people on a human level that I feel has been missing for a really long time. Sometimes I catch myself going into events now that even though everyone in the room is vaccinated, they're like, oh, hi, I'm just kind of like, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to touch anybody right now, because we're so used to being separated that we have to slowly inculcate that back into our reality. But I think it'll be really, really welcomed, at least from my perspective, for us to get things back done in person. I know for myself, I'll be traveling a lot at the end of the year, and I'm looking forward to seeing people and doing things hands-on.
Yeah, great.
I think for Muslim space, they don't actually have a space. They have used a church for their Jama services. Austin's a bit of a sprawling city, and I think this will enable the learning how to use the online apps will enable them to include more people in their activities. They're already doing that, and that will expand. I think what's most interesting is that people from other parts of the nation have discovered this particular model of a Muslim organization, and how that begins to replicate elsewhere in what sort of different versions will be really interesting to see. There's already been some interest of people wanting to learn more about the organization and to replicate it to some degree, because there are other, because elsewhere there are people who haven't found in the array of Muslim possibilities one that fits their needs.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Ali Shariati, the famous Iranian scholar who passed away before 1979. In one of his books, he talks about how the Quran begins with the name of God and ends with the name of humanity, because the last word of the Quran is An-Nas. And so one of the things I was looking at in my research is, and this is not, I know it's not going to come out right, but what is it that fills the need for a worshiper, for a believer, for an attendee at the mosque, at the church? Is it God, or is it the human being, or is it fellowship? And so, I think it relates to Rami's question, are we going to go back to how it used to be? And I think we will. And I think that the fellowship part is really vital. It's like, this debate between Hegel and Marx, I'm not going to go into that, but so where we are in terms of our spirituality, I think this pandemic has shown that me and my room and my ability to pray is not enough. The surrounding, the place where people are, and the collectiveness of that search for God, I think, is so crucial. So in terms of what I know of my community here, I think they're going to go back to the old ways as soon as they can. They will still use the technology, but it would go back to, minimal use. That's my sense.
So I want to twist the question for Nazila a little bit. Maybe this is out of your favor. So you mentioned that, like, during the pandemic, the issue of like how to bury your dead people or your belonging and your family and things like after the pandemic thing is against the most popular ideas of fatwa and Sharia. My question is how this could challenge some people who talk about the fatwas to reorder some issues in the fatwas. Like, for example, I know that's haram to not do a certain things during the burial, but how this could be something like maslaha or protection of life of others, and how this could change the order of the Islamic maslaha thingy, which is protection of deen could be the second after protection of life. Sometimes, do you think could be changing during the pandemic or after, or it will be the same?
That's a good question, Remy. As mentioned, our tradition is very, very flexible, and we learned a lot of lessons from our tradition when it comes to COVID-19 pandemic. Human life is sacred in Islamic tradition, and anything else comes after the sacredness of human life, including religious rituals and prayer, fasting, And that's what we learned from the prophetic tradition and also from the Quranic tradition as well. And the Muslim generations before, they followed the practices of the Prophet and also the teachings of the Quran when they responded to pandemics like this. COVID-19 is not the only pandemic in human history. We did have deadly viruses before, deadly diseases before. Yeah. And it's a Muslim community. They use these traditions to respond to these pandemics as well. And I think that these resources are the greatest resources for the Muslim community when it came to COVID-19. In Canada, for example, Muslim doctors and faith communities came together and they used the Islamic teachings to respond to Canadian government's restrictions in regards to COVID-19. Similarly, Muslims in United Kingdom and the United States as well, they use the Islamic tradition to respond to government restriction and how they applied and adapted the tradition to the restrictions. So in that respect, we are flexible. But when it comes to reality, of course, it's very difficult, right? So as Dr. Irfan, for example, says that we realize that we are kind of community. We belong to community. And when this is not in our life, we get stressed out and we become overwhelmed and we look for existential meaning in our life. So that is really very important. But again, when it comes to our ability, I believe that humans, they have the great capacity to respond to challenges and bounce back. And this is what we learned during COVID-19 as well. And we used technology well, for example, how we should relate to each other in the era of technology, like learning how to use Zoom, how adapt teachings, for example, in the COVID-19. However, again, the question is that the emphasis in my presentation was that Muslim community in Canada, for example, they didn't feel that they are lonely, or they didn't feel that they are lonely in Sri Lanka, because many communities came together to support them. And again, we learned this using our tradition, including Sharia, because Sharia is one of the sources of our Islamic tradition. But great questions. Thank you, Remy.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to here to conclude and thank you all for this like great panel. I believe was very useful for me. A lot of information to realize and comprehend and grasp from this panel. So, and from here, I will invite Dr. David Grafton to end our panel and our day today.
Yeah, thank you, Rami. And thanks to all the panelists for some very interesting and enlightening presentations on very different contexts that demonstrate, especially with our presentation, our keynote presentation earlier, that I don't think we'll know the end result of how COVID has impacted religious communities or communities for a while. And it's interesting to see how each of you in very different contexts have pointed out the importance of how resilient people are to seek out one another, even in the midst of a pandemic. And I very much appreciated Nazila's point about this is not the first time that humanity has experienced these things before, and until the end of time probably unfortunately will again. And the opportunities that you all pointed to, creating relationships, interfaith relationships, and how those different communities come together really is enlightening, and it's heartening that these kinds of open spaces have taken place. So thank you for sharing with us tonight, and I look forward to seeing these papers published again in the Muslim World Journal that will be coming out later this year. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Just a quick word about tomorrow. Please join us again tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a second panel where we'll be looking at the pandemics in Asia, the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia. And then tomorrow evening where we will welcome Silk Road Rising, an interfaith acting troupe that has had to shift online due to the pandemic. And a final word, I was glad to hear something several times about chaplains, and I would be remiss if I didn't say something about our new degree programs that Hartford Seminary is rolling out in the fall. We have 3 new master's degrees, a Master of Arts in Interreligious Studies, an academic degree, a professional Master of Arts in International Peace Building, and a professional Master of Arts in Chaplaincy. So if you were taken by what you heard tonight, these are the kinds of things that we're about at Hartford Seminary, and we welcome you to explore that further on our website. Again, thank you to our presenters and our panelists. I appreciate your time and the effort that you put into these presentations. They were very helpful. To everyone who's joined us around the world, good day, good morning, good night, and God willing, we'll see you again.